steps up housing subsidies for the disadvantaged, but how much will it really help? Electricity prices go up. We find out who will be hit the hardest. On the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule, we look at how the city has changed. And it's one of the most prestigious music industry events in the region. Taiwan gets set for the 33rd Golden Melody Awards. A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Betty Chen. Taiwan's government has launched an expanded rental subsidy program. It has budgeted over $1 billion to help disadvantaged households. Eric Gao has more details.
Taiwan's government is shelling out to help disadvantaged people afford housing. It has expanded a rental subsidy program's budget from $190 million to over $1 billion. The government has also eased eligibility requirements and hopes to help 500,000 families. Eligible low and middle income households can get up to $270 a month in rent subsidies, helping to cover one of their main living expenses.
租金，然后可能吃饭、加油这些开销扣一扣，我现在一个月大概3万块，要存钱真的很难啦。
Applications for the new subsidies are now open, and funds will be distributed to successful applicants starting in October. Klein Wong and Eric Gao for TaiwanPlus.
To find out more about what impact the subsidies will have, reporter Eric Gao spoke with housing activist Liu Bingyi.
What effects will this new housing subsidy program have on disadvantaged people who are looking for a place to live?
我想最大的挑战跟瓶颈会卡在台湾的房东约有7到9成，长期是在租屋的过程是用自用住宅的名义在申报，也就是台湾俗称的租屋黑市跟逃漏税的现象。那这个部分很严重的影响到政府的这50万户300亿的租金补贴，是不是有办法达到50万户原来它的一个政策目标？因为房东会担心，就是说，如果他的房客去申请租金补贴，可能之后他的税就会增加，就是不太愿意让房客去申请。
In your opinion, what else can the government of Taiwan do to ensure access to affordable housing for everyone?
大概政府学者大概都知道，大概是借由税制改革，借由一些那个金融财政的信用管制，或者是借由一些相关的政策的手法，把目前这几年不当炒作房价被垫得很高的情况之下，把它压下来。那道理大家都懂，但是这绝对是一个非常大的一个政治过程，因为毕竟党人财路是一个非常严重的一个事情。我相信政府不分蓝绿政党面对这个课题都非常有挑战性，所以如果真的要协助这些年轻的家庭的话，事实上就是把房价压个2成下来，对他们的帮助比你发10年的租金补贴给他，可能对他们觉得这样的政策更还受用。
An electricity price hike comes into effect on Friday in Taiwan. Households are largely spared from the hike, with power-intensive industrial users bearing the burden of rising costs. James Chater reports.
For the first time in 4 years, the price of power across Taiwan will tick upwards on Friday. 22,000 large industrial users will see costs rise by as much as 15%, as war in Ukraine and the lingering effects of the pandemic continue to strain international energy prices. Speaking to reporters on Thursday evening, Taiwan's economy minister said those global forces left little room for flexibility.
这个是确实是国际的燃料成本大涨，那包括煤跟天然气还有油都大涨哈，那这个是所有国家都在面临同样的问题。那台湾的涨幅其实相对来讲是比其他国家还要温和许多的。
But industrial groups are frustrated by the scale and speed of the hike.
直接跳到15%，这个超乎大家的预期，能够逐年调涨，一年调个2-3%，然后分3-4次来调整，那大家慢慢去适应。
Taiwan's energy-intensive semiconductor industry, a driving force of Taiwan's economy, will also be impacted by the price hike. Responding to a comment request from TaiwanPlus, the world's most advanced semiconductor manufacturer TSMC said it's committed to green manufacturing and actively implements energy-saving and carbon reduction actions with a long-term goal to achieve 100% renewable energy usage. But economists say chip companies will be largely insulated from rising electricity prices.
因为现在国际上对于晶片的需求呢，还是非常的显著哈。那因此呢，我相信哈，他们会有办法呢，把这个成本转嫁给下游啊。那他们受到影响就会比较有限，而不至于影响竞争力。
Cho estimates that inflation in Taiwan will increase by less than 0.1% as a result of the electricity price hike. So for now at least, the public won't be feeling the heat of rising energy costs. Asnaya Zhou and James Chater for TaiwanPlus.
The ex-boyfriend of Democratic Progressive Party legislator Gao Jiayu is now on trial over allegations that he beat her and imprisoned her in a hotel room. Gao filed a police report in November shortly after the alleged incident. Her ex-boyfriend Lin Bingshu has been held without bail for 7 months. As the trial got underway on Friday, Gao accused Lin of lying and refusing to admit wrongdoing despite video evidence. She called for the heaviest sentence possible. She also said that reliving her trauma for the court was necessary because there were other victims. Reports say his phone had intimate photos he had secretly taken of other women.
我只是一个受害者之一，那更多的人其实也需要我来帮他们在这场诉讼里面，去发声。现在他还不肯面对错误，然后还持续的在说谎。
Taiwan has issued travel alerts for 44 countries that have reported cases of monkeypox. A level 2 travel health notice is now in place, which cautions travelers to take precautions before they head abroad. It's the second highest alert level in Taiwan's 3-tier system. Since May, more than 5,000 cases of the virus have been reported in 55 countries. 11, including Taiwan, have only reported imported cases. Macao has announced a week-long ban on importing Taiwanese mangoes. That's after claims that samples tested positive for COVID-19. The Chinese territory has destroyed 100 kilograms of the fruit. It's the latest in a growing list of Chinese bans on Taiwanese food products, including seafood, due to alleged COVID contamination in the packaging. Taiwan's agricultural minister said there needs to be more scientific data to back the decision.
可以针对这样的一个情势呢，以科学的专业的角度来处理，而不是用所谓的片面的这样的一个方式。那我想这会伤害到两岸的农场贸易。
Taiwan's health ministry has released a list of the top 10 causes of death in 2021. Cancer took top place for the 40th year in a row. Taiwan recorded one cancer death at roughly every 10 minutes last year, an uptick from 2020. Health officials think this may be because of people's reluctance to leave their homes for checkups during the country's COVID outbreak. Pneumonia, cerebrovascular disease, and diabetes were all among other top killers. COVID was Taiwan's 19th leading cause of death. Last year also saw a record low number of deaths in traffic accidents, as fewer people took to the roads due to the pandemic. And now to Hong Kong, which is marking its 25th anniversary of the Handover. Chinese President Xi Jinping is in Hong Kong for a second day of events, marking the city's move from a British colony to Chinese rule. After spending the night across the border in Shenzhen, Xi arrived in Hong Kong to officiate the swearing-in ceremony of the city's new leader, John Lee. In a keynote speech, Xi praised the one country, two system framework, but said the Chinese Communist Party must be respected. He emphasized only patriots can govern the city. He added that the next 5 years under Lee will be critical for integrating Hong Kong with the mainland. When Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997, it was guaranteed a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. On the 25th anniversary, Britain and the United States say Beijing has broken its promise. Louise Watt starts our special coverage of Hong Kong on the Handover anniversary.
Over the past 2 years, the city of Hong Kong has transformed. The former British colony that functioned as a place separate from the rest of China has now come to resemble the cities under the tight control of leader Xi Jinping, seen across the border. Beijing had always touted its one country, two systems model as an example for Taiwan, a system that would allow political autonomy and for the island to run itself while being part of China. But Taiwan's leaders say what has happened in Hong Kong is a warning.
中国答应香港人民的已经被世界看穿，被香港人民唾弃。我们也更可以知道，我们一定要坚守台湾的主权、自由、民主。中国的所谓“一国两制”根本不堪检验。
But that's not how China's leader sees Hong Kong's evolution under the wide-ranging national security law imposed by Beijing on July 1st, 2020. In a speech far from the people, President Xi Jinping said Hong Kong has risen from the ashes under Chinese rule.
过去的一段时间里，香港经受了一次次严峻考验，战胜了一个个风险挑战，历经风雨后，香港浴火重生，呈现出蓬勃的生机。
A striking contrast to the view from the country that once ruled Hong Kong. The British Prime Minister said China has not upheld its commitments to freedom and rights for the people of the former British colony.
We simply cannot avoid the fact that for some time now, Beijing has been failing to comply with its obligations. It's a state of affairs that threatens both the rights and freedoms of Hong Kongers and the continued progress and prosperity of their home.
This was echoed by Washington. The United States has sanctions on 11 Hong Kong and Chinese leaders and politicians for undermining the city's autonomy. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Americans stand in solidarity with Hong Kongers and reinforce their calls for their promised freedoms to be reinstated. But as the Chinese president marks the day, announcing his plans for the next 5 years for the city and swearing in a former security chief as its leader, it is clear that Hong Kong's steady march into China's roadmap continues. James Rayner and Louise Watt for TaiwanPlus.
As mentioned, today marks 25 years since Hong Kong ceased to be a British colony and was returned to Chinese sovereignty. Renho Kilpatrick takes a look at how the city has changed over time through the eyes of Hong Kongers.
The moments that marked the historic handover from a British colony to a territory of China. 25 years ago, Britain's rule over Hong Kong came to a close as the colonial flag slipped down the mast and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region's Bohemia and China's red flag flew high. In the 156 years of British administration, millions fled mainland China for the freedoms of Hong Kong. Territory transformed from a collection of villages to a global financial center. As the 1997 deadline loomed for the return of the city to Chinese rule, Beijing made a pledge to Hong Kongers that for 50 years, their rights, their freedoms, and their way of life would be left untouched, and their ability to govern themselves would be preserved for the one country, two systems framework.
All the promise of freedom being evaporated, even worse than most of the people would expect.
Zheng's own story is a reflection of that change. An employee of the British consulate, he was detained in the mainland during a work trip and, he says, tortured into making a recorded confession. He has since been granted asylum in the UK, where over 100,000 Hong Kongers have moved to escape Beijing's tightening grip under the national security law.
Separatism, subversion, secession, colluding with foreign powers, and terrorism are so ill-defined, which means that it's been a blanket ban for all freedoms of the people. They set up a new system for handling the national security case in the judiciary. They politically appoint some judges to be handling this national security case. They also introduced the secret police apparatus, the national security apparatus. From China to Hong Kong, they also intend to impose much draconian law, such as fake news law, etc. The human rights situation in Hong Kong is going to be worse and worse and worse.
Since the law was imposed in 2020, over a dozen news outlets, including the Apple Daily newspaper, and 60 trade unions have disappeared. For over a year and a half, nearly every high-profile member of the opposition has been held in pre-trial detention under the law. This July 1st will be the first since the handover with no protests.
When you look at the pictures that are coming out of Hong Kong, all you're seeing is sort of security, these gigantic 2-meter tall water barriers that are being placed all around the sites of these official ceremonies, and also the sort of creep of the security services that political groups and parties that had protested for years. In fact, that's, been a part of the anniversary, the July the 1st sort of calendar for so many years, that protest march. But today we're hearing that these people have been called and warned by security services, called for tea, as they might be in the mainland, and told not to protest.
Lim remembers the handover in 1997 and how Hong Kongers themselves were deliberately excluded from the ceremony and the negotiations around it. At the time, they were promised the opportunity to govern themselves. But now, she says, they're further from that than ever.
It's a very considered strategy to only allow certain types of Hong Kongers to be represented. And those are Hong Kongers who are loyal and patriotic, loyal to Beijing.
In 1997, Hong Kong independence was a fringe, almost unthinkable prospect for most. But as Hong Kong's promised autonomy and democratic development have receded, it has entered the mainstream. Activist in exile Anna Kwok was born in the year of the handover. And while her political senses weren't sharpened until the 2014 Umbrella Movement protests, she says she grew up with the awareness that she and her fellow citizens were different from their compatriots to the north.
In Hong Kong, you would see people marching on the streets, attending June 4th vigils, and really voicing out their disagreement with the government very outwardly. From there onwards, I would have this fake sense that, would you say I'm a Chinese? I would think, no, I feel that sounds a bit weird, but I never, have that underlying political ideology to support or understand why I would not call myself a Chinese, but instead I would call myself a Hong Konger.
25 years since she and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region were born, Kwok says Hong Kongers are still fighting to redress the injustices of that rainy night in 1997, when they were handed from one sovereign to another without being asked what they wanted.
We talk about fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, and fighting for, having this right to decide for ourselves. But I think more fundamentally, we are really just hoping to be respected as people and as humans.
After a century and a half as a British colony and now 25 years on an ever-tightening leash under Beijing, the wait for Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong has been long. On this historic date, the barriers between the people and that promise appear higher than ever before. Ryan Ho-Kilpatrick for TaiwanPlus.
To commemorate a quarter of a century since the handover, Hong Kong is officially opening the Palace Museum, full of Chinese artifacts loaned from Beijing. But on the other side of the city, a small 2-story museum is remembering Hong Kong from another era. Bing Wang has the story.
It's a tale of two cities. One preserves Hong Kong under British rule. Another forges a new Hong Kong under Chinese control. Inside this museum, a portrait of the Queen on the British throne. And this one features a Chinese emperor and an empress. It may not look like much has changed in the 25 years since Hong Kong was handed over by the United Kingdom to China, but these museums capture a different story. Hong Konger Brian Ong has been collecting British artifacts since he was 15. 27 years later, he founded the Museum Victoria City, aiming to maintain the memory of Hong Kong's British colonial past.
I think history is quite important to every individuals, regardless is good or bad. It's always a lesson to learn and always a experience from the past. Regarding the colonial history of Hong Kong, I think is the fact and it's parts of Hong Kong.
On the other side of the city, the Palace Museum is just about to open. A gift from Beijing to mark the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong. It's a stark contrast to the Museum Victoria City, showcasing almost 1,000 Chinese artifacts and national treasures. Director Louis Ng says this museum is important for the younger generation.
我哋係要去推動中國文化藝術嘅傳承與傳播。特別喺香港，我哋希望係做多啲，特別俾青少年，我哋俾多啲機會佢哋去認識、欣賞我哋中國傳統文化。
After the national security law was enacted here, June of 2020, dissent against the ruling Communist Party has been met with arrests. But Brian Ong isn't afraid of upsetting the authorities.
This is why our city built it and how it built it, and maybe it's a dark side or maybe a bright side, but I think it's the facts and it's the reality.
After the handover, Beijing is trying to mold Hong Kong into a Chinese city. But it's people like Ong who are trying to keep history alive and make sure nothing is forgotten. David Lin and Bing Wong for TaiwanPlus.
Journalist Steve Vines lived and worked in Hong Kong for 35 years, including as a presenter with the territory's public broadcaster, RTHK. He moved to the UK last year, citing a decline in press freedom. TaiwanPlus reporter Louise Watt spoke to Vines, the author of Defying the Dragon, Hong Kong and the World's Largest Dictatorship, about the deteriorating environment for media.
In the 25 years since the handover, how have media freedoms in Hong Kong changed?
I think the answer to that is that they have changed not just slightly, but enormously. And I would say in my experience, I've been a journalist for a long time. I haven't really ever experienced a circumstance in which media freedom has declined quite so rapidly. If we flash back to 1997, the year of the handover, Hong Kong had a very vibrant media. All shades of opinion were represented. You could read a pro-communist newspaper, you could read a pro-democracy newspaper, you could read a newspaper that was neither one nor the other. So in the first, say, 2 decades, you could say, I think with some confidence, that the media was still free. It was still functioning in the way you would expect it to be. Of course, there were gradual changes. I mean, there were changes of ownership, particularly in TV stations, putting them in the hands of mainland Chinese owners. What has happened, and it happened with amazing speed in the last couple of years, was virtually all of the independent media outlets have been shut down. There have been arrests of journalists. The opportunities for making Hong Kong an international media center have diminished very considerably. I mean, nobody is seriously considering basing correspondents here when they could put them elsewhere.
Is it still possible for independent, critical journalism to take place in Hong Kong today?
That's a very big question. And my first instinct is to say that yes, in a very limited sense, I think it is still possible. Is the situation in Hong Kong better than it is on the Chinese mainland? I would argue, but I wouldn't argue very forcibly, that it is better. There are possibilities for reporting and for independent journalism that certainly do not exist on the mainland, but that sets the bar very low. I mean, nobody seriously believes that the status quo as it exists today, when we're talking on the 25th anniversary of the handover, will be the same situation as it is next year, because the crackdown on freedom of expression has been relentless and ruthless. So I don't think it's that job is finished.
And that includes our in-depth look at Hong Kong, but there's plenty more on our TaiwanPlus website with extended reports of what you have seen here. The 33rd Golden Melody Awards, known as Taiwan's Grammys, kicks off on Saturday in the southern city of Kaohsiung. This year, the GMA committee selected 173 nominees from more than 20,000 applicants. Singaporean singer-songwriter Tanya Chua holds the most nominations this year with a total of 8. She's tied with Taiwanese indigenous singer Ame for the record of most wins in the Best Mandarin Female Singer category at 3 awards each. Taiwanese singer-songwriter Hua Wei has the second most nominations this year at 7. An awards show wouldn't be complete without performances, and this year's lineup includes Taiwanese singers such as Yoga Lin, Lala Xu, Eve Ai, Wei Bird, and more. English speakers in Asia can join a live watch party on TaiwanPlus's YouTube channel. Thanks for watching TaiwanPlus News. I'm Betty Chen. Finally today, we'll leave you with images of red-crowned crane's newborn fledging at Taipei Zoo. After 11 days of renovations, the zoo reopened today to welcome the crowd during the summer vacation. For more stories from Taiwan and around the world, please download the TaiwanPlus app. Stay safe and see you next time.